Her brother sold her on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not cruelly. The way you sell furniture you forgot you owned with mild relief, a signature, and no particular ceremony. She found out on a Tuesday morning, in the ledger she kept for him, in handwriting she recognized as her own brother's, because she had spent 4 years watching him sign documents she had written. Her name was there, under a column marked Diplomatic Placements, and next to it, the name of the most powerful rival pack in the Northern Territories. She corrected the filing category before she packed her bag. She couldn't help it. That's the kind of woman she was, the kind who fixes the record even when the record is about her own undoing. She had given that pack everything. 4 years of her life, her name, her silence. She had written the treaties, managed the alliances, kept an entire border territory breathing through 3 winters, and she had done it all as no one. A ghost in the margins of her brother's legacy. She told herself that was enough. She had almost believed it. What she did not know, could not have known, was that the mountains she was riding toward already had an answer to the question she'd stopped letting herself ask, whether she was worth choosing. And somewhere in those mountains, a king who had forgotten how to let the world back in was about to find a woman who had forgotten she was allowed to want it. There was someone who needed that to never happen. But the story doesn't begin with the threat. It begins with a ledger, a red correction, and a woman who packed her bag before she grieved, because she had learned, long ago, that grief was a luxury for people who had somewhere softer to land. To understand how she came to be chosen by a king who didn't yet know he was choosing, we need to go back to the morning she found her name in the wrong column. The ledger was open on the desk when Lena came in to file the morning reports. She almost didn't see her own name. That was the thing she kept returning to. Later. She had been reaching for the inkwell, running her eyes down the column out of habit, checking Damon's entries for errors the way she checked everything of his for errors, and there it was. 3rd line from the bottom. Her name, in his handwriting, under a column marked Diplomatic Placements. She read it once. Then she read it again. Lena Ashford. Crestfall, Eastern Outpost. Valden Moore Transfer. Goodwill Placement, Territory Dispute Resolution. Beneath it, in smaller letters, a notation she recognized as the standard language for low-status transfers. Voluntary Participant. The inkwell was still in her hand. She set it down carefully. She sat in the chair she had occupied every morning for 4 years. The chair no one had officially assigned her because she had no official title. The chair that faced the window that looked out over the border territory she had spent 4 years keeping alive. And she was very still for a long moment. Then she picked up the red pen. She crossed out voluntary participant and wrote administrative transfer, involuntary, terms undisclosed to subject. She noted the date. She initialed it. She closed the ledger. She did not cry. She had learned, a long time ago, that crying was something you did when you believed the outcome could still change. This outcome had the feeling of something that had always been coming, a door she had been walking toward for years without knowing it was there. She started packing. Her room was small, and she had never accumulated much. That had been a choice, or something close to a choice. She had always known, at some level, that she was not permanent anywhere. She took her clothes, her washcloth, the small carved wooden box her mother had left her, which she had not opened in 3 years. She took the spare pair of boots she had resoled twice because she refused to ask Damon for money for new ones. And then she went to the cabinet. The cabinet was where she kept the real work. 4 years of it. Ledgers she had filled herself. Every treaty she had drafted before Damon signed them. Every note from every border negotiation she had managed while he slept off whatever the night before had been. She had kept them because she was the kind of woman who kept records. Because she believed, in a deep and quiet part of herself, that the truth was always somewhere in the paperwork, even when no one was looking for it. She packed all of it. She was tying her second bag closed when the door opened. Damon looked better than he had in weeks, which told her everything. She recognized his relieved energy the way you recognize weather. He leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed, and that particular expression he wore when a problem had resolved itself without requiring him to do anything difficult. "Already packing," he said. "Good. That's good, Lena." She looked at him. She thought about the ledger entry. She thought about 4 years of border reports and winter grain negotiations, and the peace treaty with the Falmir territories that he had framed in his office, as if he had written it himself. She said, "When do they arrive?" 3 days. He shifted his weight. It's a good placement. Valdemore's a serious pack. Stable. You'll have proper quarters. She pulled the bag strap tight. "Damon," she said, "do you know what the Crestfall Falmir grain accord is worth annually?" He blinked. "What? Nothing," she said. "Never mind." She would not tell him. She had considered it, in the 30 seconds between reading the ledger and reaching for the red pen. She had considered laying it out for him, every document, every decision, every year of labor conducted under his name. She had imagined his face. She had imagined him understanding. She had stopped imagining it before she finished the thought. Some rooms had no doors. She had learned that about Damon when she was 11 years old, and she had not found a reason to revise the assessment since. He lingered for another moment, waiting, she understood, to see if she would make it difficult. When she didn't, the relief that moved across his face was so unguarded it was almost honest. "You were always the practical one," he said. He left. Lena stood in the empty room for one more minute. She looked at the window, at the border territory beyond it, the fields she had kept producing through 3 bad winters, the road she had negotiated safe passage on when the Ironwood Pack had been testing their eastern boundary, the whole quiet apparatus of a place that had functioned because she had made it function, and had never once looked up to notice who was running it. She picked up her bags. Both of them. The clothes and the records. She walked out without looking back. The escort arrived at the gate just before noon. There were 4 of them. Valdenmoor wolves in the gray and black of the northern packs. And they were large, not tall exactly, but dense with the particular mass of wolves who had grown up in mountain terrain, who had spent their lives moving through cold and difficulty and come out harder for it. The largest one looked at her single large bag and her smaller one and said nothing, which she appreciated. She looked past them at the mountains on the horizon, gray-blue in the morning light, higher than she had expected. She had heard stories about Valdenmoor. Every pack on the border had. A king who ruled by decree from behind closed doors. A court that ran on fear and precision and the memory of a grief no one was allowed to mention. A pack so powerful that lesser wolves crossed the road to avoid their scouts. Her wolf, who had been quiet through all of it, the ledger, the packing, Damon's relieved face pressed suddenly against her thoughts. Not in warning, in something that felt, strangely, like anticipation. Lena did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she didn't know what to do with. She picked up her bag and walked forward. The mountains were not what she had expected. She had imagined them severe, unwelcoming, the kind of landscape that matched the stories a kingdom carved from granite and cold, ruled by a man no one visited twice if they could help it. What she found instead was almost beautiful, in a way that felt like an affront. The late afternoon light turned the peaks amber and the valley below them deep gold, and the escort rode through it without looking up, the way people stop seeing the remarkable things they pass every day. Lena looked. She had learned, a long time ago, to notice things other people didn't bother with. The court itself rose from the mountain's base like something that had grown there, rather than been built. Dark stone, wide archways, torchlight flickering warm against the gray walls as the sun dropped behind the ridge. It was larger than Crestfall's outpost by a significant measure. Larger and considerably louder. She heard the dispute before they passed through the gates. Voices, at least 4 of them, carrying the specific pitch of men who had been arguing for a long time and had stopped being careful about it. The escort led her through the outer yard and into the entrance hall, and the noise hit her like a wall of heat. A council session had come apart somewhere and spilled into the corridor. 3 lords in formal dress talking over each other near the far archway, a 4th waving a sheaf of documents, 2 servants trying to navigate around them with their eyes down. No one acknowledged her arrival. A harried steward appeared at her elbow, glanced at her bags, looked past her as though checking if there was anyone more important behind her, and found there wasn't. "Transfer from Crestfall," he said, more to himself than to her. "Administrative placement. Right, you'll need to wait." He pointed at a stretch of wall beside a stone pillar and disappeared into the crowd. Lena stood where she was told. She set her bags at her feet. She watched the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging exits, identifying the loudest person and the quietest one, mapping the currents of tension that ran underneath the noise. The lords near the archway were arguing about a border assessment. The man with the documents was losing. The two servants had successfully navigated around the dispute and vanished through a side door. The hall smelled of pine smoke and cold stone and, underneath both, the particular electric charge of a large number of wolves in an enclosed space. Herwolf noted it. Went still. Attentive. She had been standing for perhaps 10 minutes when the courtier stumbled into her. He was drunk. She placed that before she placed anything else, the sweetish sour edge of too much wine cutting through the wood smoke scent, and he wasn't watching where he was going. His shoulder connected with hers hard enough to send her into the pillar. Stone met her palm, her hip. She caught herself, adjusted her footing, straightened. She did not make a sound. She did not look around for help. The thought didn't occur to her. You looked for help when you believed help was a thing that might arrive. She had stopped believing that somewhere around age 12, and the habit had simply never come back. The courtier moved on without looking at her. She retrieved her bag from where it had knocked against the floor. She checked the strap. Intact. Above her, on the upper gallery that ran along the hall's second level, something moved. She didn't see him. She felt the weight of attention the way you feel. A change in air pressure. A subtle shift, a sense of being observed by something that was not merely curious. She looked up. The gallery was empty, just torchlight and shadow and the sound of the argument still grinding on below. She looked back at the room. Her wolf pressed quietly against her thoughts. Said nothing, just pressed, the way it did when it was paying attention to something she hadn't caught up with yet. The steward reappeared 20 minutes later and led her through 2 corridors and up a narrow stair to a small chamber on the administrative floor. It had a window, a bed, a desk, and a wall of shelves that had clearly belonged to someone who had left in a hurry. Files stacked at angles, loose papers, a ledger open to a page dated 3 years prior. Temporary, the steward said, already leaving. Until the proper placement is arranged. The door closed. Lena stood in the center of the room. She looked at the bed. She looked at the shelves. She unpacked her files first, then her clothes. Then she sat at the desk, pulled the nearest stack of misfiled papers toward her, and began to sort. She couldn't help it. The disorder was a kind of noise, and she needed the room to be quiet before she could rest in it. She worked through the first stack methodically, then the second. The fire the steward had lit on her way out burned down to coals, and she didn't notice. It was the third stack where she found it, a treaty document, creased and misfiled under the Ironwood Kingdoms when it clearly belonged to the Crestfall border records. She pulled it out. Standard format, standard language, the kind of document she could have written in her sleep. She had written it in her sleep. Almost literally. She remembered the night Damon's deadline, her candle burning to nothing, the careful legal phrasing she had worked out line by line. At the bottom, in the signature block, was her brother's name, and above it, in the witness line, stamped with Valdenmore's own court seal, was a name she didn't recognize. Someone here had seen this treaty processed. Someone here had watched Damon Ashford take credit for work that had passed through these very walls. Lena set the document down very carefully on the desk. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened her correction log, picked up her pen, and began to write. 3 days into Valdenmore and Lena had already learned the castle's rhythms, the way she learned everything by staying quiet and paying attention. She knew which corridors the night guards walked and when. She knew the archive was unlocked between dusk and dawn because the previous secretary had apparently lived there, and no one had thought to change the arrangement. She knew the kitchen smelled of wood smoke until well past midnight, and that the great hall echoed with the last of the evening's noise until the second bell, and that after the second bell the castle went genuinely, mercifully silent. She also knew she was not going to sleep. She had tried. She had lain in the narrow bed and watched the fire burn down and listened to the mountain wind press against the shutters, and her mind had simply refused to stop moving. It kept returning to the treaty document, to the witness seal. to the question of who in this court had watched Damon Ashford sign her work and filed it without comment. At 2:30 bell, she gave up, dressed, and went to the archive. The door was unlocked, as expected. The room was cold. The kind of cold that settled into stone buildings overnight and required a full fire in an hour to shift. She lit the small lamp on the corner table, pulled her shawl tighter, and picked up where she had left off 3 days ago. The work was soothing in the way that repetitive, useful things were soothing. She didn't have to think. She just had to look at each document, identify where it belonged, and put it there. The disorder that had seemed overwhelming on the first night was already beginning to resolve into something comprehensible. A shape was emerging. She liked shapes. She liked the feeling of a thing becoming ordered under her hands. She had been there perhaps an hour when she heard footsteps in the corridor. They stopped at the doorway. She looked up. He filled the frame the way large men filled doorways, not aggressively, but completely, the way a mountain fills a horizon. He was not dressed for court. Plain, dark clothing, no formal coat, his jaw carrying a day or two of shadow. He looked at her across the small, lamplit room with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not surprise exactly, more like a man who had been expecting one thing and found another entirely. She looked back at him. Then she looked at the document in her hands, confirmed its correct category, and set it in the appropriate stack. She could not think of a reason to stop working simply because the king was in the doorway. Either he would come in, or he wouldn't. Either he would tell her to leave, or he wouldn't. She had learned, a long time ago, that performing anxiety for an audience never improved the outcome. He came in. He sat in the chair beside the door, the one that faced the room rather than the shelves, and said nothing. He did not ask what she was doing. He did not ask why she was awake. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and the silence between them was not, Lena noticed, uncomfortable. That was unusual. Most silences with powerful men were a form of pressure. This one felt more like weather, something they were both simply inside of. She worked through another stack. The lamp crackled. Outside, the wind moved against the shutters and went quiet again. After a long while, she asked, without looking up, "Would you prefer the treaties organized by kingdom or by date?" A pause. "Date," he said. His voice in the empty room was different from the version she had heard in the entrance hall 3 days ago, quieter, with the formal edges worn off. She filed it away without examining it too closely. "Date it is," she said. They did not speak again for 2 hours. She worked. He sat. Occasionally she heard him shift his weight, or exhale slowly, or turn something over in his hands. She hadn't noticed him pick up the old letter from the side table. But at some point he had, and he was reading it with the focus of a man who needed something to do with his eyes. The fire she had built up burned steadily. The stacks on the floor diminished. The shelves began, slowly, to make sense. She was reaching for the lamp to trim the wick when she registered that the chair was empty. She hadn't heard him leave. No footsteps, no creak of the door. Just absence, as clean as if he'd never been there. The letter was back on the side table, precisely where she'd left it. Lena sat with that for a moment. Her wolf was quiet, not the watchful quiet of 3 days ago, pressing and alert. Something more settled, the quiet of a creature that had been patient for a long time and was prepared to keep being patient, because it understood something Lena did not yet. She closed the nearest ledger, straightened the stack, and looked at what she had accomplished. Half the archive, properly ordered, in a single night. She blew out the lamp and walked back to her room in the dark, one hand trailing along the cold stone wall. She was tired now in the way that came after real work. A clean, bone-deep tiredness that had nothing to do with grief or worry. She slept. In the morning, the steward knocked on her door with an unfamiliar expression somewhere between confused and cautious, and informed her that by the king's direction, the administrative vacancy was hers if she wanted it. Permanent placement. Official title. Her own desk in the archive. The steward was clearly waiting for her to look pleased, or surprised, or grateful in some visible way. Lena said, "I'll need a second lamp." She said yes before he finished explaining the terms. She had already been doing the work. It was only the title that was new. What she did not know, could not have seen, was the woman standing at the far end of the corridor as the steward delivered the news. Still, watchful. Her fingers resting, very lightly, on the signet ring at her wrist. Watching Lena's door with an expression that had nothing warm left in it at all. The first week settled into a pattern Lena couldn't quite name. Not friendship. Not the careful professional distance she had expected from a king who ruled by decree and kept his court at arm's length. Something else. Something that didn't have a clean category, which unsettled her more than cruelty would have, because she knew how to manage cruelty. She had no system for this. It started with the document. She had been in the archive 4 days when he appeared in the doorway holding a single sheet of paper. No greeting. He crossed to her desk, set it down, and said, "There's an error in the Ironwood boundary filing. Second paragraph, third line." Lena looked at the sheet. Then she turned to her own stack and found the copy she had pulled that same morning, already marked in red at the second paragraph, third line. She set it beside his without comment. He looked at her correction, then at her, then back at the correction. He picked up both copies and left without a word. She returned to her work. But she was aware, in a way she couldn't quite suppress, of the warmth that had moved through her chest in the 3 seconds he had stood there looking at her note. Recognition, she told herself. The simple, professional satisfaction of being seen to do the job correctly. Her wolf didn't bother to argue. It just settled deeper, patient and certain, the way it had been since the night in the archive. It knew something she was refusing to look at directly. The kitchen came 3 days after the document. She had discovered it on her second morning that the great hall at breakfast was everything she couldn't manage before the first bell. The noise, the performance of it, the way everyone watched everyone else and calculated their standing in the watching. She had lasted 4 minutes before retreating to the kitchen, where Mira had set a cup of tea on the table without being asked, and then gone back to her work without comment. Lena had been coming ever since. On the 7th day, she was halfway through her tea when Rowan walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he went to the counter, poured his own cup from the pot Mira had left, and sat across from her. That was all. He didn't explain himself. He didn't ask why she was there. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She noticed the scars across his knuckles, the precision of even that small gesture, and looked out the narrow kitchen window at the gray mountain morning. Mira, moving between the hearth and the preparation table, set a plate of bread between them without a word and kept her eyes carefully on her own business. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. It was the best breakfast Lena had eaten since arriving. She didn't examine that too closely either. The council session happened on the 9th day, and it was the one she hadn't prepared for. She had been asked to present the corrected border assessment records to the full council, a routine task, the steward had assured her, nothing more than confirming the updated figures were in order. She had prepared the presentation with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She knew the documents better than anyone in the room. Lord Casson apparently found this offensive. He was a large man with a small patience, and the particular confidence of someone who had never had to be right, because his volume had always been sufficient. He interrupted her third sentence to challenge a border notation. She corrected him, calmly and accurately, citing the source document by date and filing number. He interrupted again. She corrected him again. On his fourth interruption, his voice had risen to the register that usually made people trail off and apologize. Lena did not trail off. She waited for him to finish. Then she said evenly, "The notation is correct, my lord. If you'd like to review the primary source, I have it here." Casson's face had gone the color of old brick. "I don't need a transfer girl to tell me how to read a border map," he said. The room went quiet. Not the natural quiet of a pause, but the held breath quiet of a room that senses something is about to change its temperature. Enough. One word. Quiet as a closing door. Rowan had not moved from his seat at the head of the table, had not raised his voice, and yet the single syllable landed in the room with the weight of something much larger. Casson's mouth closed. Everyone else found something to look at that wasn't the king's face. "Continue," Rowan said to Lena. She continued. Her voice did not waver. Her hands, flat on the table, did not move. When the session ended and the lords filed out, she allowed herself one glance across the room. Rowan was still at the table, gathering his own documents. He was not looking at her, but the set of his jaw, tight, deliberate, told her he had been aware of every second of it. She rearranged her expression before he could look up, and walked out. She made it halfway down the corridor before she had to stop and press her back against the cold stone wall and simply breathe for a moment, not from distress, from something that had no safe name yet, something warm and dangerous that lived in the center of her chest and had been growing steadily since a night in the archive when a grieving king had sat in a chair by the door and simply stayed. She pushed off the wall and kept walking. That evening, in her office off the east corridor, Lady Petra Vane sat at her private writing desk and composed a carefully worded letter. It was framed as a courtesy, a standard inquiry, the kind any responsible administrator might send regarding the background and suitability of a new placement, practical, professional. Signed with her council seal. She addressed it to Damon Ashford of Crestfall's Eastern Outpost. She sent it before the night bell rang. The East Wing had been closed for 2 years. Lena had found the notation in a maintenance log she wasn't supposed to have read. She had been reorganizing the property records, and the log had simply been misfiled inside them. And once she had started reading it, she couldn't stop, because the East Wing's closure had been noted but never explained. And unexplained things bothered her the way open wounds bothered healers. She followed the thread until she understood. A roof section had failed, repairs had been deferred, and an entire storage corridor packed with treaty documents had been sitting under a slow leak for the better part of 24 months. She had submitted the inspection request to the steward that same afternoon. The steward had approved it with the slightly bewildered expression he wore whenever she did something that was not technically outside her authority, but that no one had thought to do before. The East Wing smelled of cold stone and old paper, and the particular damp that settled into places that had been abandoned rather than emptied. Lena moved through it with a lamp and her inventory list, checking each crate against the damage assessment she'd drafted, noting which documents needed immediate relocation and which could wait for the repairs. The afternoon light came in gray and thin through shuttered windows. Dust moved in the lamplight like slow smoke. She was wrestling with a large crate in the far corridor. It had been shoved to the back of the storage alcove, and she needed to pull it forward to check the documents inside when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew, before she turned, who it was, not from the sound, from the way her wolf went absolutely alert, the way the air in the corridor seemed to change its quality, warmer and charged with something she had stopped pretending not to recognize. Rowan stood at the entrance to the alcove, taking in the lamps she had arranged and the inventory spread across the floor. He was in the plain, dark clothing he wore when he wasn't required to look like a king. He did not explain his presence. He looked at the crate she was struggling with, crossed the alcove, and took the other handle. They moved it together without speaking. The space was small. She was aware of how close he was, the warmth of him in the cold corridor, the sound of his breathing, the way the lamplight caught the line of his jaw when he turned to check the document stack inside the crate. She focused on the inventory list, on the water damage at the corner of the third box, on anything that was not the 6 inches of air between his shoulder and hers. They worked through 4 crates that way. Efficient, quiet, competent. 2 people who knew how to do things without being asked. It was on the 5th crate that his hand closed over hers. Not intentionally. They had reached for the same handle at the same moment in the low light, and his hand simply covered hers before either of them registered it had happened. Neither of them moved. The cold of the corridor vanished. There was warmth where his hand covered hers, radiating up through her fingers, her wrist, the inside of her arm, and underneath it something else, something that had no name in any document she had ever filed. A pull. Deep and sure. Like a key finding a lock it was made for. Her wolf went completely, utterly silent, not absent. The opposite of absent, so present it had stopped needing to announce itself. Rowan's grip didn't tighten. He didn't pull away. He stood very still. And she could actually feel, with the heightened senses she usually kept carefully managed, the shift in him. The slight change in his breathing. The way his pulse, close enough to sense, had moved from steady to something raw. "Where did you learn to do all of this?" His voice was low. The private version, the one without the formal edges. She kept her eyes on the crate. "Do what?" "The systems. The work." A pause. The not asking. The not asking. She felt the accuracy of that land somewhere under her sternum. "Someone had to," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hand still covered hers. "Who were you doing it for?" "My pack." Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't think that's the whole answer," he said quietly. She looked up then. She couldn't help it. He was closer than she had realized. Close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes in the lamplight, and the thing in them that was not quite a question, because it already knew too much to pretend it was asking. Her wolf strained toward him. The pull in her chest had become a full, warm ache. She stepped back. He let her go. Immediately, completely, without pursuit. His hand fell to his side. He looked at the crate. She looked at her inventory list. The cold of the corridor came rushing back in. "I'll have the documents relocated by morning," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. He nodded once. He picked up the lamp nearest the door and set it on the shelf so she'd have the light. Then he left. She stayed until she had finished the inventory. Every item logged, every crate assessed, every notation made in her neat, precise hand. She did not allow herself to stop working until the task was complete. She walked back to her room through corridors that felt longer than usual. She closed the door. She slid down it until she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wood, knees drawn up, inventory list still in her hands. She was shaking. Not from cold, not from fear. From something that had lived in the center of her chest for weeks and had just, in a dim corridor over a document crate, made itself impossible to keep calling by any other name. Far away, in Petra Vane's candlelit office, a letter had just arrived from Crestfall's eastern outpost. Damon Ashford had been thorough. More thorough than Petra had expected, or needed. He had included dates, figures, the scope of what his sister had managed. He had offered it all up without a pairing understanding of what he was handing over. Petra read the letter twice. Then she touched the signet ring on her wrist, slowly, once, and she began to write her reply. 2 days after the East Wing, Petra made her move. She did it in the morning council session, between the grain assessment report and the Northern Border Patrol update, in the mild, measured tone she used for administrative housekeeping. Lena was present. She had been asked to attend sessions now, to take supplementary notes on document references, and she watched it happen with the particular clarity of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for the other shoe to drop. "A procedural matter," Petra said, setting a slim folder on the table. "Routine, but worth addressing given the sensitivity of the records our new placement now manages." She smiled across the table, not at Lena, at the room. "The transfer documentation from Crestfall is incomplete. Standard practice requires a full inventory of any materials brought into court from an external pack. Given what we now understand of her role there, it seems prudent to confirm what she arrived with." The room absorbed this. Lena kept her hands flat on her notepad. She kept her face arranged. She had practiced this. The stillness that read as calm rather than exposure. The silence that looked like patience rather than calculation. "There's also the question," Petra continued, still pleasantly, "of whether documents originating in Crestfall's administrative files would constitute sensitive material under the standard interpack protocols. We wouldn't want any ambiguity around the new archivist's loyalties." Ambiguity around her loyalties. There it was. Small and clean and almost polite. A seed, not an accusation. Something that could be walked back with a smile if challenged, but that had already been planted in every mind at the table. Rowan's voice came from the head of the table, quiet and final. "Denied," he said. "We don't conduct loyalty reviews on placement staff without cause. Next item." Petra inclined her head with the gracious composure of someone who had expected exactly this response, and filed it accordingly. She touched her signet ring once, briefly, and moved on. The session continued. Lena kept writing. She did not look at Petra again. She was not afraid. That was the thing she kept turning over as she walked back to the archive afterward. She had expected fear and found something colder instead, a clear-eyed recognition that the shape of what was coming had just become visible, and that she needed to decide what she was going to do about it. She was still deciding when the knock came at her door that evening. She knew before she opened it. The particular quality of that knock measured, deliberate, not the steward's impatient rap or Mira's easy double tap. She opened the door. Rowan stood in the corridor. No formal coat. The private version of himself, which somehow made everything harder. "May I come in?" he said. It was not quite a question. She stepped back. He entered but didn't sit. He moved to the center of the small room and stopped, the way he did when he was managing something carefully, hands at his sides, jaw set. She recognized the posture. She had filed it under things she noticed and tried not to think about. "Did you bring Crestfall documents with you when you came?" he said. Not an accusation. A plain question. He was looking at her directly, the way he rarely looked at anyone fully present, no glass between them. She held his gaze. "Yes." "What kind?" "My own work, treaties I drafted, records I maintained, 4 years of documentation conducted under my brother's name." She kept her voice even. "I brought them because they belonged to me, not to Crestfall, not to Damon. The work was mine." The room was very quiet. She watched him process this, watched him hold it up against the thing Petra had planted that morning and examine the fit. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. She had learned that much about him, but she could see, in the slight tension around his eyes, the careful assessment happening behind them. She watched the moment it entered, the doubt, small and unwilling, but there. He didn't voice it. He was too careful for that, too fair. But she felt it cross the room between them like a change in weather. And she understood, with a precision that bypassed grief and went straight to something steadier and colder, that this was what Petra had intended. Not to destroy her, just to introduce a question mark. Just enough. "I see," he said. 2 words. Neutral. Final. He left. She did not move until she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she sat down at her desk, not because she intended to work, but because her legs made a quiet, sensible argument for it. The room felt different than it had that morning. The same cold stone, the same lamplight, the same small fire. But something had shifted in the air, the way air shifts after a door is closed on it. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk. She pulled out the correction log, 4 years of it, the full accounting of every decision, every document, every treaty she had managed while her brother slept easy in the knowledge that someone else was holding the weight. She had carried it across the mountain range in a bag that cost her 2 months of careful saving. She had never shown it to anyone. She held it in both hands. It was not a weapon. She had never meant it as one. It was simply the record, the truth written down in small, careful handwriting because she had always believed, in the quietest part of herself, that the truth was worth keeping, even when no one was asking for it. She looked at it for a long time. Tomorrow, she decided. She would figure out tomorrow what to do with what she knew, and what to do with what Rowan now doubted, and what to do about the woman down the corridor who had looked at her across a council table with a pleasant smile, and the eyes of someone who had already decided the outcome. Tonight, she just held the record. It was the only thing she had that was entirely, completely, inarguably hers. She went back to the archive, not because she had a plan, because she couldn't sit in her room holding the correction log without doing something with the energy that had nowhere else to go, and the archive was the one place in Voldenmoor where she knew what to do with her hands. She lit the lamp. She pulled the nearest stack. She told herself she was simply working, finishing the reorganization of the treaty subfiles she hadn't completed the week before. It was almost true, but her hands kept moving in a particular direction toward the border concession records, the interhouse land assessments, the documents she had been filing for weeks and had noticed something in but hadn't stopped to examine because she had been deliberately not looking for problems that weren't hers to find. She looked now. The first irregularity she had dismissed as a transcription error, a border concession dated 3 years prior, the land value slightly misaligned with the primary survey on record. She had corrected the figure and filed it and moved on. She found the second one inside an hour. Same type of irregularity. Different territory, different date. Same 3 noble houses in the beneficiary column. By the 3rd bell she had found 7. By the 4th she had found 14. She pulled them all. She spread them across the table in chronological order, oldest to newest, and she sat with the lamp close and her correction log open, and she mapped it. It was not dramatic. It was simply arithmetic. The same 3 houses appearing again and again, always benefiting, always by small enough margins to read as clerical variance rather than intent, always in documents that had passed through the council review process that Petra chaired. 14 documents. 3 years of incremental adjustment, modest individually, significant in aggregate. Lena sat back. She had not been looking for this. She wanted that on record, even if only in her own mind. She had been filing things and noticed. That was all. The sky outside the archive's high window had begun to shift from black to the deep gray that came just before dawn when she heard the footsteps. She knew them. She had known them for weeks. Rowan stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, and then at the documents spread across the table, and something moved in his face, not surprise exactly, more like a man recognizing the shape of a thing he had been circling without naming. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight rawness around his eyes. He crossed the room without speaking and stood at the far edge of the table, looking down at the spread of papers. The unresolved tension of last night sat between them in the lamplit room. She did not try to address it. She simply gestured at the documents. "Look at the beneficiary column," she said, "across all 14. He looked. He picked up the first document, then the second. He worked through them in order, the way she had laid them out, and he was quiet the entire time, the focused, thorough quiet of someone who understood what they were reading and was not rushing to the conclusion. The fire had burned low and the gray dawn was coming fully through the window by the time he set the last one down. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the table. She watched him absorb the scope of it, not just the falsification itself, but the timeline, the patience it had required, the position it had required. When he looked up, his eyes were clear, steady. Something had settled in him that had been unsettled since last night. And she understood, with a relief she didn't let herself show, that it had settled in her direction. "Why are you showing me this?" he said. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. "Because it's yours," she said. "It's your kingdom. It affects your border lords." She paused. "Because it's the truth and you should have it." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have used this," he said. "Last night after the council session, you could have held it and traded it for your own security." She looked at him steadily. "I know. Why didn't you?" "I don't know how to do things that way," she said, simply, without apology. He held her gaze. The lamp between them was burning low, and in the dimming light his eyes had gone that particular shade of clear gray that she had learned meant he was fully, completely present. No glass, no distance, no careful management of what he let through. Her wolf went very still inside her, not the patient still of waiting. Something deeper, something that had finally stopped needing to wait. Hours, it said, soft as a breath. Lena's fingers rested against the edge of the table. Rowan's hand was perhaps 4 inches from hers. Neither of them moved, but the air between them had changed again. The way it kept changing in rooms where they found themselves alone. Warmer, charged, weighted with the accumulated pressure of weeks of almost and not yet, and both of them pretending not to feel the pull. He picked up the documents, carefully, deliberately, the way he handled everything that mattered. "I'll need to review these before the morning session," he said. "I know," she said. He left. She stayed. She sat in the cooling archive as the full dawn came through the window and turned the stone walls pale gold. And she let herself feel, for one unguarded minute, the thing that had no safe name and had stopped caring whether she named it. She did not know that 3 floors above her, a corridor servant was already delivering a report to Lady Petra Vane's door. She did not know that Petra read the report, set it down, and reached for her writing paper with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. The letter she wrote was addressed to Damon Ashford of Crestfall's Eastern Outpost. It asked him, with warm and courteous urgency, to come to Valdenmoor in person. It said there were matters regarding his sister that required his direct attention. It said to come soon. Damon arrived on a Tuesday. Of course he did. Lena saw him from the upper corridor as he crossed the outer yard, the same easy walk, the same way of moving through a space as though it had been arranged for his convenience. He looked around Valdemoor's mountain court with the mild, appraising expression of a man visiting somewhere he had decided in advance to find adequate. He had dressed well for the journey. He always dressed well. Appearances were the one currency he reliably managed. She turned away from the window and went to collect her correction log. The session was called for mid-morning. Petra had framed it as a formal inquiry, a loyalty review, which was the technical designation for exactly this kind of proceeding, and which carried enough procedural weight to require full council attendance. Lena had been notified by a written summons delivered to her door at first light. She had read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in her records drawer. Then she had picked up the correction log and carried it with her all morning, the way you carry something you have decided you are ready to use. The council chamber was full. Every lord at the table, standing advisors ranged along the walls, the court secretary at his post in the corner. Rowan sat at the head of the table, and when Lena entered, she made herself look at him directly. His expression was still, controlled. He watched her cross the room with eyes that gave nothing away to the council and gave her, in the space of 2 seconds, everything she needed to know. He would not stop her if she chose to flee. He was telling her that. She did not want to flee. Damon was seated near the middle of the table, to Petra's right. He looked at Lena when she entered and had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. This was more than she had expected from him. She noted it without warmth and sat in the chair assigned to her, the correction log on the table before her, her hands flat on either side of it. Petra opened the proceedings with the composed, regretful efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant duty. The accusations were more complete now than they had been a week ago. Lena had arrived at Valdenmoor carrying sensitive Crestfall documentation, which she had used to establish administrative access. Her competence, rather than being genuine, was a cultivated presentation designed to secure proximity to sensitive court records. Her brother could confirm the scope of her activities at Crestfall's outpost, the breadth of information she had managed, the access she had held. "We are not here to punish," Petra said with warm, measured sadness. "We are here to understand." The room was very attentive. Lena let Petra finish. She let the silence after settle fully. Then she opened the correction log to the first page and placed her hands on either side of it again. "I'd like to show the council something," she said. She did not ask permission. She simply began. She walked them through it in order. The first entry, 4 years prior, a border assessment she had corrected after Damon submitted figures with a transcription error that would have invalidated a treaty negotiation. The next. She did not rush, and she did not perform distress. She named each document by its official designation, cited its current location in Valdenmoor's own archive, and explained, in plain language, what decision she had made and why. 4 years. Every treaty. Every negotiation. All of it under her brother's name. All of it in her handwriting in the correction log, dated and initialed, because she had believed the truth was worth keeping, even when no one was looking for it. Damon's discomfort had curdled into something more complicated. He was looking at the log. He recognized the handwriting. He recognized the dates. She watched him doing the arithmetic she had already done years ago, the arithmetic of what he had signed and what she had written, and what the difference between those two things actually meant. He did not speak in her defense. But he did not speak against her either. He simply sat with the mathematics of it and went quiet. When she reached the final entry, she closed the log. She looked at the council. "I am not an intelligence asset," she said. "I am a woman who kept records of her own work because she knew she would need them someday." She paused. Apparently today is that day. She reached into the second folder she had brought, the one she had prepared 2 nights ago in the archive, while the dawn came through the window. She placed the 14 border concession documents on the table. She walked the council through those too. The beneficiary column, the 3 houses, the timeline, the pattern. The room went very still. Petra's expression did not break. She was too composed for that. But her hand moved to her signet ring and rested there, and did not move away. Lord Casson, 2 seats down, was leaning forward with the expression of a man who had suspected something for years and had just been handed the evidence. Lena finished. She stepped back from the table. She did not look at Rowan. She had said everything she came to say, laid down everything she had carried, and whatever happened next was no longer hers to manage. For the first time in 4 years longer, maybe she had nothing left to protect. No arrangement to maintain, no careful presentation to sustain. She heard him stand. She heard his footsteps crossing the stone floor. Measured, deliberate, unhurried. She looked up. He was not looking at the council. He was not looking at Petra or at Damon or at the documents spread across the table. He was looking at her, only at her, with those clear gray eyes that she had learned to read in lamplight and morning kitchens and silent archives, and what was in them now needed no interpretation. Done waiting. That was what it said. Done. He stopped in front of her. Close. The warmth of him reached her before his hands did, and then his hands were at her face, careful and certain, and his forehead came down to rest against hers in a gesture so quiet and so complete that the room around them seemed to recede to a great distance. She reached up. Her fingers found the back of his neck. The bond had been building for weeks, a tide held back by every wall she had ever built and every wall he had ever built, and all the weeks of almost and not yet, and 2 people who had forgotten, separately and for different reasons, that they were allowed to want things. The claiming came like the resolution of something long held his mouth at her throat, warm and deliberate, and then hers at his, and the bond that locked into place between them was not a sound exactly, but every wolf in the council chamber felt it, a resonance that moved through the stone walls and, the cold mountain air, like a bell that had finally been struck after years of silence. The room did not react immediately. Then Lord Casson exhaled slowly and said nothing, and looked at the border concession documents with the expression of a man who had just decided several things at once. Lena's wolf said nothing at all. It had been waiting too long to feel the need to speak. It simply settled, deep and warm, into the place it had always known it was going to be. The council chamber emptied in layers. First, the standing advisors, then the lesser lords, moving with the careful urgency of people who understood that the ground had shifted and wanted to assess it somewhere private. Lord Casson was among the last to rise, and he paused at the door long enough to look at Lena with an expression that landed somewhere between acknowledgement and apology. He had suspected Petra's record manipulation for years. She could see it in the way he had moved through the border concession documents, not surprised, but confirmed. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Petra left without being asked. 2 of Rowan's senior guards flanked her at the door, which made it a removal without requiring the word. She walked between them with her spine straight and her expression composed, and she did not look at Lena. Her council seal was left on the table. The door closed behind her. Lena stood at the table for a moment in the sudden quiet. The correction log was still in front of her. The border concession documents were stacked where she had left them. The fire in the far hearth had burned low, and the afternoon light through the chamber's high windows had gone the flat gray of late afternoon in the mountains. She picked up her log. She straightened the stack. She did what she always did after something important. She put things back in order, because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her caught up. Rowan handled Damon in the anteroom. Lena did not ask to be present for that. It was not her conversation to witness, and she had said, that morning, everything she needed to say. She went to the archive and sat at her desk and did not pretend to work. She simply sat, in the room she had made her own over weeks of careful, methodical, unrequested labor, and let the quiet settle around her. An hour later, Rowan found her there. "He's gone," he said. She nodded. I showed him the full accounting. He crossed to the chair by the window. Not the door chair this time, but closer, angled toward her. Every document, every decision with the date and the context. She waited. He didn't argue, Rowan said. He read it and then he sat with it. A pause. I left him to that. It was the right thing to do. She had known, long before today, that there was no confrontation with Damon that would produce the understanding she had once wanted from him. Understanding required a kind of attention he had never developed. What the accounting would produce in him was something quieter and longer lasting. The simple, undeniable arithmetic of what he had signed and what she had built. That was enough. It had to be enough. She was done carrying the rest of it. Come with me, Rowan said. His study was at the far end of the residential corridor, a room she had never been inside, though she had catalogued the books he'd ordered for it and filed the repair requests for its window shutters. It smelled of wood smoke and old paper and something particular to him that she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. A fire had been lit already. The mountains were visible through the window, darkening toward the first edge of evening. He did not sit at his desk. He stood near the window, and she stood near the door. And for a moment they were simply two people in a quiet room together, which was, she understood, exactly what this moment required. What do you need? He said. The question landed simply, no ceremony, no formal declaration, just that. She opened her mouth, closed it. The question was so straightforward that she had no procedure for it, no system, no form to fill in with the correct information. She had spent so many years managing other people's needs, working within other people's structures, making herself useful in the space between what was asked and what was required, that the direct and uncomplicated question of what she herself needed had become genuinely difficult to answer. I don't know, she said. I'm not practiced at it. He nodded once, as though this was exactly what he had expected and exactly what he had already decided was acceptable. Then we'll figure it out, he said. He crossed the room to her. Not fast, not dramatic. The same measured, deliberate way he moved toward everything that mattered. He reached for her hand. His fingers, scarred across the knuckles and careful in everything they touched, closed around hers. She let him. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. At the clear gray eyes that had found her in an entrance hall full of noise, and registered her the way you register something you have been looking for without knowing it. And she felt, moving through her chest like the first real warmth of a room after a long, cold journey. Why? The specific and extraordinary sensation of being somewhere she did not need to leave. Her wolf said nothing. It had nothing left to say. It had known, from the first night in the archive, what this was. It had simply waited for her to catch up. Lena turned toward the window. The Valdenmoor Mountains filled the glass, the way they always did, dark stone against the evening sky, enormous and permanent and indifferent to the small human arrangements happening at their base. She had looked at them with caution on the day she arrived. She had looked at them with longing and unease for weeks after. She looked at them now and felt no desire to make herself smaller against their scale. No arrangement to maintain. No careful presentation to sustain. No correction to make in red ink. Just the mountains, and the warm weight of a hand holding hers, and the uncomplicated, terrifying beginning of something feeling of a woman who had finally stopped helping the world forget her. 6 months after a Tuesday that changed everything, spring came to the Valdenmoor Mountains. It arrived the way spring arrived everywhere, in high country slowly, then completely. The snow retreated up the peaks. The valley below the court turned green in patches, and then all at once, the stone walls of the castle, which had held cold all winter like a long memory, finally began to release it, and the corridors smelled of thaw and pine, and the particular freshness that comes when a place that has been closed for a long time opens its windows again. Lena opened hers every morning now. The administrative systems she had built in her first weeks were the kingdom's standard practice. The archive was organized, maintained, and staffed by 2 assistants she had trained herself. The border lords had their corrected records and their restored territories, and they had begun cautiously, then less cautiously, to bring their disputes directly to the Queen, rather than routing them through the layers of intermediaries that had accumulated during the years of Rowan's withdrawal. She handled them the same way she handled everything, Quietly, methodically, with complete attention, the correction log lived on her desk. It always would. Not as a wound she kept reopening, but as a reminder that the record mattered, that the truth was worth keeping even before anyone came looking for it. Rowan sat in council now. Every session. He asked questions and made decisions and was present in the way that a king needed to be present, and the court, which had learned to work around his absence, was slowly and somewhat awkwardly learning to work with his return. He was still not a man who enjoyed crowds or noise. Some things the grief had changed permanently, but he had stopped governing from behind glass, and the difference was visible in every room he walked into. The kitchen was still theirs at dawn. That morning, Mira had left the pot on the hook and 2 cups on the table and disappeared back to the hearth with the perfect timing that suggested she had been doing this deliberately for months. Lena sat with her hands wrapped around her cup and the pale spring light coming through the window, and Rowan sat across from her and told her about the letter from the Falmere territories. A trade proposal, unexpected, with terms that were actually reasonable for once, and she laughed. Fully, without the calculation of whether it was appropriate, or whether it would be noticed, or whether it gave too much away. He watched her laugh with the expression he had worn since the council chamber, the one that had no management in it, no glass, no careful distance, just him, looking at her, the way he had crossed a room full of watching eyes to reach her. She had stopped finding that expression unsettling. Damon's letter had arrived the week before. It sat on the corner of her desk, opened now, read once. He had written carefully. He had said things that were almost, in their way, an accounting, not quite an apology, because Damon had never been practiced at those, but an acknowledgement. The arithmetic, finally. In his own handwriting. She had read it once and set it down. She had not picked up the red pen. She did not need to correct him anymore. She did not need to annotate his understanding of her, or mark his errors, or maintain the record of what she had been. She knew what she had been. She knew what she was now. The correction log on her desk held 4 years of proof, and it would never need a single addition, because the woman who had written it in borrowed lamplight and careful silence had finally, irrevocably, signed her own name. She looked out the window at the mountains. They were the same mountains. They had always been immovable, indifferent, older than any arrangement made at their feet. But the woman looking at them was not the woman who had arrived in a borrowed dress with a single bag and a face arranged carefully into neutrality. That woman had made peace with being small. This one had decided, at last, that she was done. Thank you so much for spending time with Lena and Rowan's story today. If this one moved you, I'd love to hear which moment stayed with you. Drop it in the comments. It genuinely means everything to read your thoughts. If you're new here, there are more stories waiting for you on this channel, each one built to make you feel every single thing. Come back soon. There's always another world worth stepping into.